If there's no budget passed by the end of the extension, which is the end of March, an election is automatically called and has to be held within 90 days. So my theory is that's what's going to happen.
Today is Wednesday, January 28th. This is Boundless Insights, and I'm Aviva Klompas. Israeli elections have a reputation for being confusing, and for good reason. No party typically wins a majority, governments are built on fragile coalitions, new parties constantly emerge, and alliances shift on a regular basis. Israel is legally required to hold an election by October of 2026, but few expect the country to wait that long. Between public outrage, demands for accountability, coalition pressures, and ongoing debates about security, governance, law and order, and national identity, the question isn't just when the next election will take place, but what kind of political landscape will emerge. To help make sense of all of this, I'm joined today by Lahav Harkov, senior political correspondent for Jewish Insider and a longtime observer and analyst of Israeli politics. In this conversation, she'll explain how Israeli elections work, what could trigger an early vote, who the key parties and figures are, and how the political landscape is shifting. There's a lot to cover, so let's get into it. Lahav, welcome to Boundless Insights.
Happy to be on the show.
This is so overdue. You are one of the keenest observers of Israeli politics and Israeli elections, and this is, of course, an election year, so you are now my go-to person, and be advised you're on standby from now until whatever happens.
Thank you. You could call me anytime.
Israel's political system is famously complex. It's parliamentary, it's based on proportional representation, nobody ever seems to win a majority, they're always building and rebuilding coalitions, there's the ever-present threat that it's going to topple because somebody in the coalition is going to walk away. So we need you to actually clarify first how Israeli elections work, and then we can talk about what we can expect in this coming year.
So I always like to explain the system by starting on election day. So you're Israeli. A few weeks before the election, you get a little postcard in the mail that tells you where your ballot is, where you go to vote. And you take the postcard with you, you take ID with you. So for those who live in the US, and voter ID laws are very controversial. In Israel, you're required to carry ID from age 16, so not controversial.
We need ID to get into Costco, but not to vote. That's how it works.
Right, exactly. So you go to your polling place, you go behind a screen, and in front of you is a tray with a lot of different compartments, some usually between 30 to 40 compartments. In each compartment, there's a pile of little stacks of paper that have not even the party names on them, but abbreviations of 1 to 3 letters representing each party. And there's a list up inside the screen in case you're not sure which letters represent which parties. So you pick your slip of paper, you put it in an envelope, you come out from behind the screen, and in front of the people who are watching the poll, you drop your envelope into the box. So it's very low tech, despite us being the startup nation, although computers are used for part of the counting process. Once the votes are counted, any party that gets less than 3.25% of the vote, which will end up being most of the parties, does not get into the Knesset. And then from the ones remaining, which in the last 15 years ago has been 10 to 12 parties usually, the 120 seats of the Knesset are divided up proportionately between them.
And how many parties in general will be on the ballot?
So we don't know yet because an election hasn't been called yet, so we don't know everyone who's going to register, but it's 30 to 40.
Okay, so about a third will make it through.
Yeah, and there's a lot of parties that are like weird, like
give us an example.
Well, there's always the pirate party, which I know in some countries in Europe that have a lot fewer problems than Israel. Like, that's a serious party, actually. They're like anarchists, basically. There's a party called Green Leaf, which is pro-legalizing weed. And one year, they ran together with the Holocaust Survivors Party. So it was the Green Leaf and Holocaust survivors. It was obviously like a marriage of convenience because they thought that if they combined forces that they would get it. But the ads were very funny.
I bet. Okay, so we whittle away all those types of parties and you end up with about a dozen.
So yeah, like 10 to 12. And usually in more recent years, the difference has sort of been whether the Arab parties run as like one block, or sometimes they run as 2 blocks, or sometimes they run as 3 different parties. So because when they raised the threshold, the Arab parties were afraid that they wouldn't pass the threshold. So at that point, they all ran as one block. But now they've sort of since 2019, they've run in a bunch of different configurations. So it used to be that you had a big right-wing party, which was Likud, and a big left-wing party, which was Labor. Labor's had a bunch of different names over the years. So has Likud, but they've basically been Likud since the late 1970s, whereas Labor has continued changing its name all the time. Right now, they're called the Democrats, technically. Now, it's not so simple. Like, on the right, Likud is still the big right-wing party, and there are other satellite parties, which are mostly just religious parties to varying degrees. But the left is very fragmented. So you actually have a couple of centrist parties, and you have Labor, which is the center to left, I would say. And then you had, in this Knesset, Meretz didn't get in, but in the past, Meretz was the far left.
Tell us why there are so many parties, because most of us are used to being in a political system where there's two major parties, maybe three, maybe four, but Israel has dozens. So why is that?
So it goes back to the days of the Yishuv, which was the representative body of the Jews living in mandatory Palestine, right, in pre-state Israel, where they had a parliament-like structure, and they would vote on different things, and then the leadership, which was Ben Gurion and other major figures of the time, would represent their interests, sometimes to the British if they needed different things. And so you had a lot of interest groups that came together. And so today, while many of the parties do represent different political positions, a lot of them just represent different political interest groups and population groups. So you have two ultra-Orthodox Haredi parties. You have one that's Ashkenazi and one that's Sephardic. It used to be that you had two Ashkenazi parties, which were the Hasidic Ashkenazi Haredim and then the Lithuanian ones. But they eventually merged, but the Sephardim felt that they weren't being represented enough. They started their own party in the 1980s. So things like that. I mean, there used to be a Yemenite party in the 1950s, for example, and then they split into two Yemenite parties. So that's no longer the case, but there have been identity parties or identity-based parties throughout Israel's history because of sort of those roots, and these groups didn't want to give up on having their own representation. Another example is Yisrael Beitenu, which they're not officially the party of Russian speakers, but they were founded by Avigdor Lieberman, who immigrated from Moldova, I believe. But much of the party's representatives are from the former Soviet Union, not all of them. But their political positions tend to map onto at least the older generation of Russian speakers in Israel who are less integrated into broader Israeli society. And then you also have the Arab parties, which, there's no law that says the Arabs have to run in their own parties, but they choose to, again, because you have all these identity-based parties. But of course, within the Arab population, you have the more religious population. So you have an Islamist party, which weirdly, in Israel, the Islamist party is very socially conservative, but they're more, I would say, politically moderate and centrist than the other parties. And then you have an Arab Communist Party and a sort of Arab nationalist party whose founder is a fugitive for spying for Hezbollah.
Oh, okay. I actually challenge all these people that accuse Israel of being white European colonialists to come and look at all these different parties that reflect the diverse identities of Israel. And your answer really gives us insight into why it is that it is so hard for a single party to be able to capture a majority. And that's what's so often leading to the political instability, is this need to build coalitions. Before we get to what potential coalitions could look like, let's talk about timing. So Israel is legally required to hold an election by October of this year.
October 26th, I believe.
Okay, but tell us the realistic scenarios for when you believe it'll actually be called, and what are the factors at play?
Predictions in Israeli politics are a fool's game because it's so crazy. Usually the budget bill is submitted at around October. In theory, you're supposed to pass by the end of the fiscal year, and then you could have an extension. Now, if there's no budget passed by the end of the extension, which is the end of March, an election is automatically called and has to be held within 90 days. So my theory is that's what's going to happen. And the reason is because the Haredi conscription issue, right? Which is that the IDF is very short on soldiers. They want Haredim in the army. The vast majority of the political spectrum in Israel wants Haredim in the army, but the Haredim don't want to be there. And the coalition needs the two Haredi parties to vote for the budget in order for it to pass. And so while the negotiations are going on the conscription issue, the Haredim refuse to support anything else the coalition does. So the coalition is very much paralyzed in what it can do, and that includes the budget. And I just don't think they're going to solve this problem in the next 2 months.
Basically, it comes down to the Haredim are going to want certain concessions in the budget that cannot be delivered, and so they will not allow the budget to pass, and therefore it will trigger an election.
Right. And the budget is related to the conscription issue because they get all kinds of welfare benefits that, according to court orders and also according to what most of the Knesset seems to want, these extra welfare type benefits that they would get would be suspended for those who don't serve in the army.
Right. You mentioned that trying to make predictions in Israeli elections is a fool's game. And Netanyahu is obviously incredibly adept at political navigation. And I imagine he's got some plans of his own about when the timing is. From his perspective, if he had his way, when would he want the election to be?
So I think that there's two good dates for Netanyahu. One is to make it like on, I don't know, like September 30th or something.
I was very specific. I'm marking it in my calendar, and if it's right, I'm coming back to you. Okay.
It's not. It's like a random day. I don't know exactly when the holidays fall out this year. But the other answer is if Israel does something really cool, I don't know, the regime falls in Iran and Israel makes peace with the new leader or something like that makes Netanyahu look really good, then he might want to call a snap election right after that so that he could run on, I have transformed the Middle East.
Right. And that is an assumption that I've heard from a lot of people, is that in an election year, he likes to have a dramatic win. Maybe it's military, maybe it's diplomatic, an expansion of the Abraham Accords, maybe with Saudi Arabia, but that becomes the platform by which he can say, look what I have accomplished. Nobody else would be able to do this. But there is this 90-day waiting period between when an election is called and when it happens, right?
Yes. Netanyahu is a really good campaigner and has usually been able to turn that 90-day waiting period to his advantage, but you never know. The polling doesn't show that Netanyahu has a majority, but then like when you ask people who is the best candidate for prime minister, he actually does better than anyone else, right? So maybe people aren't sure what they want, but it seems like there's a lot of anger still at Netanyahu for not taking any kind of responsibility for October 7th. And so it is possible that he will really suffer from that, and he will probably have to campaign really hard to overcome that.
That's another factor. We're still waiting for President Herzog to tell us whether or not he'll be granting the pardon or if there's a pardon with conditions. And depending on how that goes, Netanyahu might want a little bit more time to create distance between the decision and the election.
Right. So the pardon has to do with Netanyahu's corruption trials. He's charged on a variety of things, some of which the court suggested that the prosecutors drop the charges, not all of them, but the more severe one, which is bribery, because they don't think that the prosecution has a good case for bribery, but fraud and breach of trust, perhaps. That being said, Netanyahu was indicted already in early 2020 and didn't have any impact. I mean, he's won a bunch of elections since then. So I'm not sure that's a real factor.
Noted. Okay, so tell us, who are the major parties and individuals to watch in this upcoming election?
Well, of course, there's Likud and Netanyahu, and sort of what is the October 7th effect, right? There's Bezalel Smotrich, who's the finance minister. His religious Zionist party is projected not to pass the threshold, which is interesting because the religious Zionist sector is very influential in Israeli right-wing politics, but sometimes there have been years that their influence has been felt greater within Likud, like in 2009 to 2015, I would say, is their sort of golden age where you would see so many kippas in the ranks of Likud. And sometimes they're felt in their own party, right? Which is like when Naftali Bennett was leading a religious party, he did quite well with them. So I think that's always an interesting story to look at. On the left, or the center and left, the sort of anti-Netanyahu bloc, the big story, first of all, is that they don't have a clear leader. And when they don't have a clear leader, the votes are spread out, and that's an advantage for Netanyahu. But the candidates right now in the polls, the major candidate is Naftali Bennett, the former prime minister, who has always been quite right-wing in his actual positions, his policy positions. But because he's running against Netanyahu, and things have become so revolving around the question, yes or no Bibi in Israeli politics, he's not considered in the right-wing bloc anymore, right? But other people in that bloc are Yair Lapid, who is not doing great in the polls, but will probably pass the threshold. Benny Gantz, who it's kind of an open question if he's going to pass or not. Gadi Eisenkot, another former IDF chief of staff who was a Knesset member in Gantz's party and now has his own party, is polling okay. And then you have Yisrael Beitenu, also a party where many of its positions are actually pretty right-wing by Israeli standards, but is against Netanyahu. Oh, and there's also a new party of reservists, IDF reservists, and led by Yoaz Hendel, who's a former cabinet minister who also served in this war, wasn't required but volunteered. He's like around 50 years old, so it's not just politics, it's also age, I'd say, but he wants to represent the interests of reservists and how he feels that the reservists, sort of united and came together from all different political positions and parts of the population.
Very often in recent years, Israeli elections seem to come down to a referendum of for Netanyahu or against Netanyahu. But there are big issues at play. And I wonder to what degree these issues are going to animate the next election. So issues like October 7th and an inquiry, post-war governance, Gaza, judicial reform, settler violence, Haredi enlistment. What do you think are going to be the issues upon which Israelis vote? Or ultimately, do you think it actually just is, again, for or against Netanyahu?
When the hostages were still in Gaza, there was a lot more anger about how the war was being conducted, or at least divisiveness about how the war was being conducted, because you had a large percentage of people who said to prioritize the hostages and a large percentage of people who said prioritize defeat Hamas. And it was often difficult to figure out how you can do both of those things at the same time, and that caused a lot of rancor. Now, I think the war itself is not the issue for most people. And I mean, because it's sort of winded down. But what I do think are two really big issues for Israelis right now are, number one, the Haredi conscription. Look, it's been a political issue for 27 years now, ever since the first Supreme Court ruling overturning the exemption. But I think that it'll be bigger than ever before. And it remains to be seen how much it'll influence the election, because I think in the past, there was a lot of talk and that it didn't. But the feeling I'm getting is that this time it will have a bigger influence. And then there's actually just regular economic bread and butter issues. You see all these statistics that the Israeli economy is booming and the tech sector is booming. But first of all, the tech sector booming, a lot of it has to do with these huge sales and not as much with the sort of startup economy that Israel once excelled at. And it's just because of that situation, it's not necessarily trickling down to the average Israeli very well. And prices are really high because, all of the import rates really went up with all the Houthis blocking shipping and all kinds of other things, and the government needing more money to conduct the war. Taxes went up. And so I do actually think that the economic issues are going to be a really strong issue in this election. It's not as interesting for the people who don't live in Israel, maybe, but it's what is on the average Israeli's mind.
Right. That makes a lot of sense. And I guess I should have asked you before when we were talking about the pardon, do you think that it's plausible in any way that the condition by which President Herzog is willing to give Netanyahu a pardon is that he steps out of political life and he actually doesn't run in the next election?
I think Herzog is very sort of an astute observer of Israeli politics, and he knows that's a condition that's not going to be met.
Because he thinks Netanyahu won't accept it?
Right. He thinks Netanyahu won't quit because of it. And so I doubt that he would even ask for that unless, in his mind, it's good for him to offer it and Netanyahu to turn it down.
Okay, so some political calculations. We will see what happens. There is a very good chance that if he runs, Prime Minister Netanyahu could in fact be reelected. And people, especially outside of Israel, will find that astounding because of his corruption charges, because of the mass protests in Israel, because he was prime minister on October 7th and in the years leading up to October 7th and presumably should be the one to take responsibility. So despite all of that, why is it that many Israelis may choose to stick with him?
There's a couple of things, but people who support Netanyahu and really view him as like a generational leader. They're looking at the glass half full, right? Because there have been a lot of victories and major achievements in this war. It started out with, the worst crisis, tragedy in Israel's history. But then, look at how weak Hezbollah is, and Assad is gone, and Iran. In many ways, Israel is in a very strong strategic position, a much stronger strategic position than it was, the summer of 2023. And that's what they would say about that. And they would credit, Netanyahu's, for as the reason that would happen, for that happened. The corruption cases, as I said before, I don't think they ever had a big impact on the vote. Netanyahu was indicted. It was like a month before an election or something like that, or 6 weeks before an election, and it didn't change anything, and he still won. But I just don't think that's a big factor. I think that the people who support him, they tend to support judicial reform and believe that there are major issues with the way the courts in Israel conduct itself, and that's like, I could spend an hour just explaining that whole situation, so we shouldn't get into that too much now. I think that Netanyahu has always been, Mr. Security. And there are a lot of people who still feel that way, who say there was a big failure. They don't necessarily blame him for it. Either they think that the army didn't share the information with him on time, which all indications show that the morning of October 7th, they really didn't share the information with him on time. But of course, there's also the lead up and the policies that the government had before that, right? So there are truthful things people on both sides can say about this topic. But in any case, they're going to look at the glass half full.
Fair enough. We have to wrap soon, but I have to ask you, who do you think is going to win in the election? Who do you think will form the government?
I think it's too early to say. We don't even know when the election's going to be. Don't pin me down on that.
No predictions here. Okay, well, we'll have you back on when it's called, and you can give us your prediction then.
All right.
Lahav, thank you so much.
Thanks.
That's a wrap on today's episode of Boundless Insights. This show is produced by Yochai Meital and Alma Ben-Zev. Whether you've been with us from the start or are just discovering our show, we are so glad you're here. If today's conversation sparked a question, challenged your thinking, or made you nod vigorously, I want to hear from you. Email me at podcast@boundlessisrael.org. Your feedback gives us ideas for new topics and new guests. And if you believe these conversations matter, there are 3 easy ways to support the show. First, follow or subscribe so you never miss an episode. Second, help us spread the word. Share an episode with friends and family, post about it, or mention it in a group chat. It really does make a difference. And third, consider supporting our work. Boundless is a nonprofit, and we rely on donors like you. You can make a gift at boundlessisrael.org/donate. Until next time, stay curious, stay informed, and keep the conversation going.